It's that time of the week again for another episode of FSUFO. Ah, there's my sound. That music just that gets me revved. It's got the right grit there, Justin.
I'm into it.
Anyway, yes, FSUFO, also known as Forbidden Science, where we look at all things UFO, all aspects of it, and we're going to look at one today here. We have a different kind of guest today, Justin. We have somebody who I met a long time ago and has been somebody that I know behind the scenes does the hard work in the trenches. You don't often see him like on television or, being talked about as somebody that's a mover and a shaker, but he's one of the guys that's out there getting the things, doing that tedious work that's just essential to the field to give it some credibility. And we're lucky to have him here today. And you know what? When we first met, I think it was the July 4th weekend, 1996. And it was the first time I presented on a stage in the U.S., something that I did quite a bit of after that first date. And if I remember right, it was Greensboro, North Carolina. And that's where I first met Jan, who's our guest today, Jan Aldrich. Jan's both a historian and a ufologist. And like I say, he was instrumental behind the scenes. I was at a Canadian UFO conference last week, done virtually on Zoom, and his name came up a number of times as people wondering what he was up to. Maybe he could help them find whatever. So in the field, he is known and not well enough outside. And hopefully, if we get an audience, as we expect here in the new year when these episodes get released, we can add to spreading the good word about him there.
This is
So
really
anyway,
exciting for me. I'm not really too familiar with Jan's work other than through some of the stuff I've read in your previous works and other people's works on Shag Harbour and otherwise. So, it's really this is a big deal for me.
well, he was, I
Real
think the
support
title would be,
character.
he was the director of Project 1947. You've probably heard of that, which was
Amazing.
just a massive, painstaking project he did gathering. I don't know if it was this large, but it seemed to me like it was, you know, all the news clippings, in the planet about the UFO. My greatest memory of him is watching him in the morning, looking for him around the hotel hallways and seeing him going across the floor in the convention center with literally grocery carts full of hard copy documents,
Wow.
of paper clipping. Grocery carts full. Yes. It was no
Amazing.
exaggeration. So we'll get him to talk about that, many other things, what's going on in the field today, Project 1947, kudos and pet peeves and whatever else that Jan thinks is important, because the next hour is his here. So if our disembodied voice slash producer can bring Jan into the fold, there he is there. Welcome to
Okay.
FSUFO.
Hey, Jan.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks
I,
for having me here.
oh, it's a pleasure, Jan. I just, once your name come up, I thought, why haven't I thought of him before? And,
Right.
there's so many people I got in the wish list, but I remember calling you a few years back for some help on something, and I know you're just that guy. Your name comes up when I least expect it, dealing with people I know in the field. Because you're that guy that's out in the trenches doing that hard work that brings some sense of reality to this, some sense of documentation, and you think of a project like 1947, and some people go, they shrug. But if they knew what it meant to the researchers as a resource and how much effort that takes, how much dedication to, you know, maybe you could start and just tell us what that is, since your name is one of the few things still on the web that they can go in your name. And if it wasn't for you, it wouldn't be happening, or wouldn't have happened, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, I don't try to get out in much, getting on TV and podcasts and things, but it's necessary to do this sometime.
It is.
Try to get leads and things from people. So, um, Project 1947. If you want to go to the website, it's www.project1947.com. And also up there is the Sign Historical Group, which is a history group we started in the late 90s. And so that has a lot of things also that are not just in the Project 47. Um, we are mostly I've tried to stay in the background, help out people like Lauren Gross and other people like Dominic Weinstein with his aircraft sightings and things like that. Stay in the background more or less. Um, Project 1947 was a historical thing to try to find out about the first publicized UFO wave after the Second World War. Of course, with Kenneth Arnold, when his sighting hit the paper, all hell broke loose, and about the next 2 weeks, everybody was seeing UFOs. In fact, it was one of the biggest sky watches of all times. People were seeing weather balloons that they'd probably never noticed in the sky before because everybody was watching the skies. Um, the mayor of Hartford came to Hartford, Connecticut here. He came to work one day and he says his whole staff and everybody in the building were out on the steps looking up at the sky. And he said, "What's going on here?" "Oh, we're looking for flying saucers." He said, "You guys all get back to work." so,
Well, it's been
so
said,
that was,
sightings breed sightings, eh? Yeah.
yeah, that's the truth. And of
Mm.
course, there were things like this. Somebody would call up the radio station. He says, "They're coming across the river. They're going right towards your studio right now." He says, "Okay, well, I'll go up on the roof." And, somebody just sees them as they pass by, as they're going off in the distance. So that was kind of what it was like back then. And not too the thing is, at the time, they didn't make many recordings of programs, but there were a lot of programs about UFOs because it piqued the public's imagination.
Hmm. Well, it made people look up too. And when I say sightings breed sightings, some people, of course, you think of the negative connotation of that, but it works the other way too. If everybody's looking, if there's something there to see, then it gets seen, then it gets recorded, or hopefully anyway, that's what happens. But when you mentioned about all the people you helped and worked, you mentioned some of them there with the aircraft files and Project 1947. I mean, I am one of them that you helped in a big way very suddenly, not long after we met. I remember, I couldn't give you the date of it, but I remember one day getting this rather excited phone call from you that telling me that you'd gone through the UFO files of John Brent Musgrave and you found an APRO file and you thought it was important and it was about Shag Harbour and you had to get it to me right away, and you did. And when I looked at it, it turned out and still remains, um, of those sort of primary sources from back in the day, perhaps the best document we have. Yeah, it's nice that we got all these military ones. We got the orders that went between the bases. We've got memos that went through the Defense Department. But that APRO file contained so many details we would not have found elsewhere, like who the consultant was for the military, who would received any artifacts recovered, all this. And of course, I went and followed up with, personal interviews where I could of them. But without that, that stuff would have been lost to the dustbin of history, as we say. So I felt the benefit of your efforts behind the scenes. And like I say, just last week, I was at a virtual Canadian UFO conference where your name came up several times, and that was the idea there. And it was clear that behind the scenes, you are well known. You're not a familiar face on the TV. And like you say, these things sometimes have to be done. For the amount of times I was on television and other mediums, I often didn't go looking for it. They would find me. But, you know, that's the other side of the biz, But you're, without without your efforts, there's a lot of cases, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of understanding that just wouldn't be there in the field. And, the spotlight doesn't get on. It's like now, eh, as time goes by, I think that happens. So it's like nowadays you have movies coming out about the women that did the math at NASA. You know what I mean? Some of the lesser, or they're not really lesser characters, but they had been thought of as that, have come forward, and you see those contributions, and the work of people like yourself has been key to that. And you do it selflessly.
Yeah, so Project 1947 was to try to get, I have some primary sighting reports from people that were still alive in the 90s, but mostly it was to go to newspapers. Now we've got a lot of newspapers that are online, but at the time in the 90s, there weren't that many. So I had to. What I did is I went across part of Canada, so this Canadian connection, and later on I did visit John Musgraves. I visited Chris Rakowski and several other people in Canada, and I went to 48 states and Canadian provinces, and of course the capital in Washington D.C., which has the Library of Congress, which has a gigantic newspaper collection, trying to find out what was reported in the papers at that time. And there's certain amazing things that only got reported in newspapers, local newspapers. We had somebody flying out of Dallas, and it was a military flight, and the radio guys and the engineer saw a UFO come by, and as it came by, the radio guy noticed that his radio was being interfered with, and that was only in the in that I'm sorry, I said Dallas. I should have said Austin, which is the capital of Texas. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was only in that one newspaper that happened, and there's so many things like that. And of course, when I sent you that file from APRO, that was when I was at Musgrave's place. He let me use his files, which he had quite a bit of 1947 material that he had collected. He let me copy that, and since I was up there, I said, while I'm here, I'm going to copy everything I can till my copier burns out. I got in trouble with the customs guys coming back in the United States.
Really?
Said,
Really?
you didn't tell us you were taking this to Canada. Said you bought this in Canada. I said, please look at this copier. It's beat up. It's old. I am not trying to smuggle a Japanese copier from Canada into the United States. I said, this is old. It's I was able to show him. I think I had something taped on it that showed it was about 5 years old. So
Yeah.
he let me go without paying taxes.
I can tell you a better one than that when you talk about paying taxes at the border. I had done a lecture down in Boston. In fact, it was in Watertown there where they had that awful shooting incident there with the brothers. And on the way back after the conference, they were very happy at it. And, besides getting my payment and saying my goodbyes and staying a few extra days with some very kind U.S. people that I'm still friends with, I received a number of gifts, and one of the things somebody gave me was a hockey puck because they thought, well, he's a Canadian, he'll appreciate a hockey puck. Justin, you're going to grin at this one. And I can't remember the player's name on it, but it was a player, get this, with the Nordique, the Quebec Nordique, right? long toast at this point, no longer a team. Well, when I got to the border and I had this hockey puck, and when they went through my belongings and all that, um, they get to the hockey puck and they start thinking, well, this could be valuable. This is probably like, it's got a signature on it. This could be like a Babe Ruth first edition hockey card or something. So they're trying to figure the value of it. And I'm saying, man, you can't know anything about hockey. It's the Nordique. I said, here, you can have it. I'll give it to you. I took it to be
Yeah.
kind. It was a gift with a lot of other nice things. And they're like, oh, no, 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 we can't do that. And they didn't want to let me pass. And I missed the bus. And oh my God, it was terrible. For a hockey puck from the Nordiques, you know, border people, this is what happens.
I
Right.
hope they gave you trouble for a Guy Lafleur there, because otherwise, oof, I don't know.
Oh, if it had been Guy Lafleur, I would have had some idea of its worth. But some no-name player on the Quebec Nordique, I'm like,
Okay.
man. In fact, you know what? I
Yep.
just remembered who it was. I believe it was Bob Marois. He
Okay.
was a goon. He was a goon.
Love it.
Yeah, an
Jan,
enforcer.
let me ask you a question about your research with Project 1947. Great to meet you, first of all. Pleasure to meet you. I've heard lots about you. When you talk about boots on the ground research like that, and collecting, going in there and copying all of these newspaper clippings, what was the process of putting the Project 1947 together? Like back then, I mean, you're hand typing everything into a database, correct?
More or less, yes. Um, well, what I did is I tried to go to the states or the provincial capitals, because you have the legislative library or the provincial library there, and you can get ahead. Get a lot of newspapers that were accumulated there, and the same in the United States. In the usually there's a historical society or um, a state library, and they accumulate newspapers. And in Texas, they had what at the time I was doing this thing, they had what uh, uh, the University of Austin, University of Texas at Austin, was the one of the main collectors of newspapers. The United States had what was called the National Newspaper Project, and they wanted at least one newspaper from every county. And so usually I find out which organizations were part of the National Newspaper Project and went to their libraries and went through the newspapers, copied out clippings. If they had Xerox, that was great. Some of them had them on microfilm, so I could make copies from microfilm uh, readers that had reproduction. Some of them I had to hand write out. Um, Not only that, I went to the National Archives, and I got kind of sidetracked doing all kinds of other things, like um, the Project Blue Book files. I, I had copies of those on microfilm at home, but um, the 4602nd Air Intelligence Service Squadron investigated UFOs for about maybe 3.5 years, from 53 to about 56, a little bit in 57. So those were not part of Blue Book. They had decided not to put those on microfilm, so I got those out, and I think I'm one of the few people that did. And I made copies of anything that looked interesting. I didn't copy the whole files. There was quite a bit. There was also something called the U.S. Intelligence Command, which apparently made copies of UFO reports and distributed them to other agencies like the CIA, the NSA, Army, Navy, Air Force, and all kinds of Air Force organizations also. So when you look at Project Blue Book and it says file missing, I'm sorry. There's a lot of people that had copies of these things. The CIA got copies of every UFO report in 5 copies. And the NSA got it in 3 copies. And even before that, messages that went through the Pentagon Message Center, the Air Force Message Center, the CIA got a copy of every one of those UFO messages starting in 1951. So these things exist other than in Blue Book. And of course, the 4602nd, sometimes they would just write Blue Book and say, oh, we have these sightings, and this is a balloon, these are birds, these are aircraft, and they would just give them a list of cases without sending in setting in their case files. So 4602nd things had interesting things that were not in Blue Book because they only sent in sometimes just lists. Sometimes they sent in the investigations, but a lot of times they just sent in a list of which ones they looked at and what their idea was. The date, which was in 55, not 57. And then Lauren Gross looked in there in the Project Blue Book files, and he found what Project Blue Book had. They had different information than the 4602nd. And so he was in California. He went to the newspapers and got a whole bunch of new information on the case about the people that were watching it from the ground and calling the radar station. So putting that all together, we then knew one of the pilots. Well, we knew both of the pilots' names. The 4602nd, the pilots had drawn a picture of what it looked like and the area that they had covered, and it coming in and out of the clouds. So by doing that, not everything is in Blue Book. There's a lot of material that isn't, and the 4602nd, some of that material is there, and there were 2 or 3 other places that we found UFO reports that went to the government, besides the Navy. Of course, the Navy has some too, and the CIA had some, and the NSA had some, and everybody, they tried to get them to disgorge these things, but I really think they haven't. They've only disgorged some, just a few, not the extent that they're really there. And of course, you guys in Canada, you're part of NORAD, so they have the service reports, communications instructions for reporting vital intelligence, which is the acronym is service reports. And both the Americans and the Canadians report these, and some of them some from the American side were in Project Blue Book. Some have shown up in one place or another in government files, but the vast majority of service reports are classified still today. However, the Canadians are not so big on classifying stuff. So we have access to service reports in 2021 here, which go to Chris Rakowski.
Yeah.
And they're at the University of Manitoba, and they have a scanning project going right on. And I'm happy to say that we were able to contribute about $5,000 US to to that project, and it's topped off now. And sooner or later, probably after COVID, they will start scanning these things, and they go back, I think, 2 or 3 decades. With what's already been released, it goes back further than that. But the last 3 decades or so are now at the University of Manitoba as part of their archives. It's a
I
great
mean,
thing.
it's a great example of how important what you've done is. This kind of work. You see what I mean, Justin? Eh? Like Justin was largely unfamiliar with you, and I'm saying, well, this is where the work really gets done. Where I just can't stress that enough. And when it comes to the Project Blue Book and that, and when you think about the Condon Committee when it was looking into some of those cases, one of the things that always got me, and McDonald was big at pointing this out, was even though these guys had the clearance, a presidential clearance to get access to all these files, I can remember that in many cases, it's right in the book, that when they went to look for things like some of the X-15 sightings, in files, that they were refused entry to where these things were being held and never got their hands on them, although they held a
Yes, they were.
presidential clearance. Yeah.
The Edwards Air Force Base, they just kept denying that they had any sighting, and
Mm.
uh, the Condon Committee had information about it, and they just would not, said, "Hey, you're not supposed to be treating us like this. You're supposed to give us full cooperation," and they didn't. And also, there's several cases where there were aircraft accidents, like Kinross in the United
Yes.
States,
Yeah. Lake
and so
Superior.
and they asked for the crash reports, and the commander at Norton Air Force Base at the time, who held the crash report, said, "I give you one paragraph summary." So instead of going back to the Pentagon and saying, "Hey, these guys are not giving us the information we need to do your project," Dr. Roy Craig, just wrote a memo on top and said, "We're not supposed to be treated like this." Well, that's no
Yeah.
good. You
No.
gotta stand up for yourself, and
Yeah.
he didn't do that. And um, uh, speaking about the Condon report, we've been discussing this. Of course, Avi Loeb is talking about um, using telescopes and sensors and optical things to find UFOs. And he says, well, there's not much there before my project here, which is incorrect. And I'm sorry, you have to know history. And I'm afraid that Avi Loeb and Luis Elizondo, they really don't know history, and they should know history. They should take a crash course. Um, they're
Let's get into
looking
that.
for
Yeah.
yeah
Jan, let's
yeah
talk
they're
about that.
saying yeah
Yeah.
they're saying anecdotal sightings. No, there's no instruments out there. There's not. Okay, when Condon had his project, they had 130 cases they submitted to the Prairie Meteor Network. What this was all overlapping um, all sky cameras. In other words, they had a view of the whole sky um, periodically every night that was clear. They had views of the whole sky on these cameras. They were, like I said, all sky cameras. And so Condon took 130, which is nowhere close to the number of UFO cases he got. But he took 130 and submitted it to the Prairie Network, And they were able to find about 20 cases that came up on all sky cameras. Now, that's something you may have an anecdotal sighting of a UFO, but now you have instrumentation that shows you this. And this is not, I think it was mentioned in the Condon report that he submitted 130 cases, but the results are not in the Condon report.
No.
So
No.
that's something that, was done before all these guys are saying it's anecdotal. Of
Yeah.
course, with the Minot case in October 1968, October 26, 1968, B-52 flying by, the radar guys told the B-52, go to this location and tell us what you see. And the pilot asked, what am I supposed to see? He says, you'll know it when you see it. And the radar guys in the B-52, now this does not have any nuclear weapons on it. It's after it was on alert status. When the aircraft goes off alert, they check the aircraft. They send it up for about 72 hours to see that every system is okay, or if there's maintenance that has to be done or anything. So the radar guys started taking pictures of the UFO on their radar screen, which was following the aircraft. So they got some very good radar photographs. So that's not anecdotal anymore. You've got the radar things, and you can analyze the radar. And 4 people did. The head of the UFO project in France looked at the radar photographs. A radar expert in England looked at them. Dr. Richard Haynes, who worked for NASA, he looked at them, and we were down there talking to Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Matson, who was retired from the Air Force, and we showed him these things, and he knew just looking at the radar photographs, he knew exactly what happened. He said these things are going back and forth behind the aircraft, and sometimes they're going 1,000 miles an hour. And so there is something you can look at that is, it's got sensor data on it. So there we are. We have radar data. NORAD has thousands of uncorrelated cases, and they're on the computer, and they can be retrieved. And if you've got UFO cases, if we could get that data, or if the latest UFO project in the Pentagon could get that data, they could retrieve it. So they would have sensor data, which is not anecdotal.
No, but in that release, they seem to be asking for suggestions as to where could we look beyond the training. I mean, when I read that, I thought, "Oh my good God, give me a break." You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's
When
what
it
I'm
looked,
thinking.
it's
These guys
crazy.
don't have any idea about what's
No,
really
they
going
don't.
on.
No.
Nor do they have any a real understanding of the UFO history, and that's unfortunate. So they make statements like, "Well, all the data before today is not worth anything because it's just people's sightings, using their eyes and brains, and that's not good enough. We need sensor data." And there's a lot of sensor data that could be found and rounded up. And I think it's a big mistake that they don't. It's a tragedy that they don't understand this data does exist.
Let me ask you a question, Jan.
Sure.
Do you think that's a lack of their own due diligence, or do you think that they're not being properly debriefed on the history of the phenomenon?
I think they're not being properly debriefed. And if you listen to Luis Elizondo, he says, I don't want to know about cases before I I took over AAITP. He said, I don't want
They,
to know that because
yeah,
it'll prejudice my view. Oh, come on. I'm
you know,
sorry.
the thing
You know,
is when you
I
look at,
got 25 years in the army, and a lot of times I went to places where I was assigned to a job that I knew nothing about. That's not an excuse. What they told me is, you don't know anything about it? You better start finding out how to do it. And when I was in Europe, we went to a briefing for senior NCOs. We had a giant auditorium with all these senior NCOs there. Sergeant Major of 7th Army comes in there, and one of the first things he says, how many of you people had training for what you're doing right now? And I'd say about 60% of the NCOs in there raised their hands. And Sergeant Major said, so how do you know how to do your job? And he asked 2 or 3 people, and he said, we had to we had to hit the books and find out what we were supposed to do. And we had to ask people that had done the job before how they did it.
So
That's
you think this
the
is
way
like
we did it.
laziness
And
on some level too?
that's the way Avi Loeb and Elizondo should be doing.
Gotcha.
yeah, one of the things I find is when something's historical, people tend to devalue it automatically that don't
Right.
understand history. They just do that. But you know what? When you go back, when you talk about a case as you did, Jan, where somebody takes a photograph of an old style scope, and they secured that data that way, that to me in some ways had more value than nowadays when the software gets involved with it, because I've looked at radar cases. I looked at one out west at an airport near Winnipeg, and the thing was, when you looked into it, you couldn't get answers. They just had a new system installed, the deca system, and at the time they couldn't get the kind of answers as to how many times did a target have to paint if it didn't have a transponder before it would be assigned any value on the screen to show. You know,
All right.
they didn't even know what the rotation rate was till somebody went up and tried to just time it out. These things were all company secrets, right? And everything's being interpreted by the software. But in the old days, you looked at this raw data, and when they took a picture of it, you know, in some ways that was more valuable, more certain.
Yeah. I'd like to tell you about one more case
Certainly.
because it's kind of personal. I worked for I was in meteorology for a while. I One of my bosses had been out to Christmas Island in the Pacific, the old uh, nuclear test site that the British used, and what they did, they reactivated that and several other islands around there. It was called the Line Island Experiment. And what they did is that's when they started out working on weather satellites. So they had a weather satellite that they stationed over Christmas Island, and they were taking observations from the surface and in airplanes, and they were taking cloud observations, and also all around um, uh, the oceans around the island and everything. So uh, my my later boss, Sergeant Warren Bourdin, he was out there taking an observation uh, after nightfall, and there's this light out there. He says, "This is Christmas Island." At the time, no aircraft flew over that, flew anywhere around it. So he had to powerful flashlight he was using to record his data, and so he had a government weather bureau form. It's called the Wayband 1, and that's what he was recording the data on. So he took his light and he flashed it at this light. Well, the light starts coming closer, and so he flashes the flashlight, and the light reacts to his flashlight. So he said, "Oh, that's got to be the Coast Guard PBY that got us out there." But he wrote down that he saw some kind of a light. He's going back to the barracks, the cantonment area, and he sees the PBY sitting in the water there, you know, going up and down in the waves. There's nobody in it. It's not lighted or anything. So that wasn't the culprit. So he reports it. They found out there was a sighting a couple of days before that. The head military guy called the two people in that made the sighting, had them fill out forms and stuff, but they had the Wayband form, which is official. So they submitted it to Boulder, Colorado, where the National Atmospheric Administration is, and they also submitted something that was just a rumor as far as Sergeant Bourdin was concerned, that had been seen by the satellite. Well, his time of observation, the satellite did not have any reaction to anything. But about a half an hour before that, there was a bright light on the satellite. And that satellite's way up there, so it really has to be a bright light to show up on the satellite. The people in NCAR in Boulder, they submitted that to Condon, who never acknowledged their sighting. But some people, since McDonald was an atmospheric physicist, some people at Boulder decided, we'll give this to Dr. McDonald at the University of Arizona. So that's how this thing came down. It is not in Blue Book. It's not in the Condon papers, but it is in McDonald's papers. And there's that Wayband 1 form where he said, "Hey, I saw some kind of a strange light reacting to my flashlight." And that's, there you got a satellite detection of a UFO. To me, that's amazing. That's good stuff. That happened in February 16, 1967.
Would you know what kind of satellite? Was that a Vela satellite, maybe, or
I think it was a Taurus at the time.
a Taurus? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, they were specially wanted to tropical. They wanted to do tropical observations, and the satellite was part of that. But it was also to see if they could calibrate certain surface things going on the surface with the satellite. Of course, the resolution of the satellite was not that great, but when you have a bright light, it doesn't have to be great. And so a half an hour before Bourdin made his observation, there was something over Christmas Island that was showing a very bright light. And like I said, at the time, there was nothing there. The aircraft didn't fly over it. They didn't visit it. Now cruise ships visit Christmas Island, but not at that time. Not
So
in
this lack of
67.
This lack of transparency between these new organizations within, governmental departments, how do we change that information flow? Is there any hope?
Well, UFOs are not we're not taken serious for. I think it'll be a long time before they can get everybody on board. I think there's also political between the agencies. The Air Force is probably embarrassed by what happened under their watch, and they don't want any historical review of what they did. So the director of national intelligence gave him cover and said, "We're starting in 2004. That's the beginning of this investigation. It should go all the way back to Foo Fighters." We found out that when Foo Fighters started to be reported, uh, reports were transmitted to the Pentagon, and they were put in binders. We'd like to find those binders, but we have found a number of Foo Fighter reports in the regular um, archives documents. In fact, Hanford in Washington State is where they made the plutonium for the bomb for Nagasaki, and they were having UFOs come over that in 1944-45. In fact, the 4th Air Force was so concerned, they asked that Navy pilots that were in the around the Hanford plant to chase these things as a part of their mission. So they were out there chasing these things. We got 3 reports from actual pilots, but there's documents that say these things are appearing over Hanford, and it tells what counteraction should be done. And besides that, the head of the Hanford plant, after the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, he had promised the Seattle, I think it's the Seattle Times, that he would grant them an exclusive interview. So when he was talking about what they did at Hanford, he just came right out and said, "Yeah, we strange aerial intrusions over Hanford plant here."
I
In
wonder if
40,
Condon. I wonder if Condon ran out and saw them. He was there.
yeah, I don't know.
He was
And
in Hanford. He wasn't at Los Alamos. You know, he was part of the Manhattan Project. He was at Hanford working with the centrifuges.
yeah, maybe he did. Um,
It didn't
they
sway him, did it?
they did bring um, uh, radars to Hanford because of this. I mean,
Wow.
it wasn't something minor, and they did tell aircraft stay away from Hanford. It's off limits area. Don't fly near it.
Wow. For
So,
the uninitiated, Jan, maybe you should explain what Foo Fighters are. We know what that is, but some of the listeners could be new.
okay. It's essentially an overarching name, but really, Night Fighter Squadron in France was the one that invented the name. Where there's food, there's fire. Um, and it was
Smoke.
about lights that the Night Fighter Squadron saw at night. Uh, but it's come to mean anything in the Second World War that was a UFO. Essentially, it's, you know, pre-47 UFOs, and there's a lot of cases, and the British have cases in their files,
Hmm.
and the Canadian. My friend was he was interviewing pilots, and he quit his project before he got to the Canadian pilots, but Canadian pilots were seeing these things in World War
Yeah.
II. and a few Australian pilots. So
Yeah. Both sides saw them, both Axis and Allied pilots
right,
seen them. And it was interesting when the war was over, when they looked at the reports they would leave with their commanders, and that is that, you know, the Brits would think it was a German development, and the Germans would think it was a British development they were seeing, which tells you they didn't know what they were seeing, of course.
right. The head of intelligence in Europe after the war, he did make an inquiry. So now we know who the head of who uh, who had the Foo Fighter project in Europe, and also the results are inconclusive. They couldn't figure out what they were, but they asked a lot of German scientists and pilots what were these things, and they had no idea. They weren't some secret weapon. There's no,
Mm.
as one person said, if you're got a secret weapon, you've got to have um, receipt for materials and things that you order, you know, aluminum and all these other things that you have to do to build aircraft. And there was no such thing like that. And they talked to the main engineers over there, and they said, "No, we don't know what you're talking about." So, and that we just recently found it's on my website. You look for 1945 when you look for cases. It's in there. It's the report from Europe about what they found out about Foo Fighters.
I know when the war was over, they even took out the Horton brothers and got one of them drunk and asked him about it, thinking he might have inside knowledge, you know, that did the original flying wing designs there in Germany.
Right.
But of course, he knew
Yeah.
nothing. He just kept drinking the beer, though.
Yeah. They specifically in 1947 went and tried to interview him again, and yeah, they one of them had gone to Argentina at that time, but the second one had said, "No, it's not, it's not mine, it's not mine." He had a
You
lot
can't
of
help but make
trouble.
that connection, though. That
Yeah.
Yeah,
aircraft looked remarkably what Kenneth Arnold drew or explained, right? It looked
yeah,
very similar.
Yeah.
yeah. They had the Hortons had gone and looked at jet engines to see if what it would take to put them on their aircraft, that they were working on. Um, so there was some attempt, and there's another guy at Wright Field that did worked on flying wings for his own. I can't remember the name right now. German scientist. He was there at Wright Field,
Mhm.
and he
Oh,
also wanted to know about these. They asked him about that, and he says, "No, it's nothing that the performance is beyond what I was working on."
Hmm.
who's that? Von Braun? Who is that?
No, it wasn't von
Oh,
Braun. It was one of
before it?
the scientists that was allocated to Wright Field. Von Braun and his guys went first to White Sands, and then they went to Alabama. So,
Mhm, mhm.
um, and then they were
Interesting.
transferred to NASA afterwards.
Right.
I
So,
think I think the word "foo" originally came from the French, FEU, and then later just got
yeah,
anglicized. Yeah, for
right.
smoke, like Foo Fighter. Where there's smoke, there's
Yeah,
fire.
that's what they.
Yeah,
Uh,
from the
Yeah,
French.
feu meaning fire.
Hmm.
yeah, the Captain Chamberlain, I forget what his first name is. If you go to my site, I've got a lot of Foo Fighter things on there from 43 to 45. A lot of, and one of the things, Captain Chamberlain was the intelligence officer for the 415th Night Fighter Squadron. Uh, First, they had to clean up the name because it wasn't just Foo Fighters. There was, you know, a
Mhm.
few swear words put in there. So that's how they got Foo Fighters. But there was a um, a comic strip at the time, and
Stoke.
it was about firemen. So they kept talking about Foo,
There you go.
which
Yeah.
of
Yeah,
course is what you
firefighter.
say French for fire.
I want to hear some of
Stokely.
these old derogatory terms for UFOs. I'm interested. Let's bring those back.
I'm quite sure some of those pilots, when they're seeing them, they do have.
Yeah.
Well, the ones on the East Coast here just recently, they were swearing up a storm at them.
I'd love to see that classification.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man,
Well, I've heard your language, Justin, when you were videoing one.
it's exciting.
It wasn't terribly creative. There was a lot of f bombs in there. I'll tell you.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what. Yeah.
it does bring that out in people somehow. Yeah. Well, where do you think we're at now, Jan? When you see this situation and there's all this talk and hope that disclosure. I'll tell you what my feeling is. I often say to people, they go, "Well, don't you think wouldn't it be great if they just let it all go and they just handed it out to you?" And I've always felt that if I didn't believe the government when the government was telling me there's nothing to it, move along, why should I believe them when they say, "Well, here's the truth"? If they weren't
Yeah, yeah,
credible before, what should make them credible now?
yeah. That's my problem with it. I believe in what Barry Greenwood uh, says about the government. He says they always lie when they talk about UFOs. And he has experience. I've done enough digging through government documents, and so is he. And so they have trouble with the truth on this thing, and they constantly tell you there's nothing to it, nothing to it, nothing to it. And 20 years later, you get to look at some of the stuff and they're really worried about it. There's one case right now that it went to what's called the Watch Committee here in the United States. It was 20 September 1957. Started out at Montauk, and two UFOs went from Montauk to Chicago and then hung around in Chicago for a while and caused interference on radios and things like that. And they took it for a Soviet reconnaissance flight. So uh, it went to the Watch Committee, and the Watch Committee was in one day of briefing the president on it when they decided, oh, there's nothing to it. One thing the Watch Committee does when they look at something, a lot of times they burn the documents afterwards, but there's CIA documents that put it with the Watch Committee, and there's Project Blue Book documents that put it going to the Watch Committee. So they can't do that. So it's there, and it's very interesting, and it's one of those things that everybody says, well, it's historical. So no, it's not. It's a real interesting thing. Robert Todd asked the Watch Committee for their files on it, and he got a smart-ass answer from one of those captains there. He said, "We're not a repository of UFO reports." That's not what he asked. He's in violation of the FOIA, but it doesn't matter. And Todd didn't pursue it. I wish he had, because when he pursued it, he usually took it to the nth degree, and eventually somebody had to really answer what he wanted.
From the perspective of a historian, ufologist, over your time on this enduring mystery, what have you found for you personally to be the most compelling interest that's been brought to your attention for what I would call
Uh,
UFO reality?
well, I have to put Shag Harbour way up there. I
Ah!
think especially when you're telling me now that the woman at the lighthouse saw a dish-shaped object.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
is amazing.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know what? that guy McDonald who did that documentary.
Oh yes, yeah. He's one of
Yeah,
the producers of this. There.
yeah. Um, the Canadian government wrote me, and they wanted an independent evaluation of the
I
value of doing a documentary supported by the Canadian government on Shag Harbour. And I said, "Why are you why are you writing me? I'm a prejudiced source. I think this is an important case."
hmm.
Um, but I wrote them. You know, I tried to make it as objective as possible. I said, I don't know what it is, if it's a UFO or if it's uh, um, a secret test that's gone wrong or whatever. But I said it's historical and it should be covered. And you know, and then McDonald calls me on the phone and says, "Whatever you wrote them, they've decided to support me." And
Well,
I said, "Well, that's great. That's great."
yeah, there you go. And it remains on the website of Library and Archives Canada that the case is open and unsolved, officially,
Right.
like on the site. It's like I say, my famous line that I got when writing a chapter for Kevin Randall's book, UFO in the 90s, as he says at the end, as Stiles says, the Shag Harbour incident remains the world's only UFO crash scenario that is supported in that interpretation by government documents that are freely available and entirely without controversy as to their origin or their authenticity.
Yep. And witnesses are not blowing up
No,
like,
no,
like Kevin's
no.
head.
Is that how he put it? Yeah, yeah. He's
Well,
got a way of.
they had this the one guy that was supposedly the admin, and he called himself a spy, and they found out he had doctored all his documents uh, for his supposed CV,
Hmm.
and so
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and it did come out for a couple of years, you know, because it's embarrassing to everybody.
Yeah. It's.
The other one that we did was that uh, I keep coming back to the Minot case because
Mm,
there was so much work done on this.
yeah.
We interviewed the pilot starting off, and he couldn't remember any names of the crew. And we went back to his home, and he went in his files, and there he had a picture of the B-52 that was involved there, and all the crew are standing out in front of the B-52, and their name tags are all visible. And once he saw the name tags, he said, "Yep, that guy, that guy, that guy, that they were all there." And so my friend Tom Tulane went to each and every one of them and interviewed them, and also the guys on the ground who had also seen it. And then we found a real good set of radar photographs, and that is just such a great case. And
Yeah.
it's you
Yes.
got each person on the airplane from their viewpoint what the UFO was like. The radar guy, the EMC guy, the tail gunner, the co-pilot and the check pilot, um, they all had their own views of what it was like,
Mm.
and that's great. It's just everything came together.
Well, I figure at this
Wow.
point your arm's getting pretty numb there, Jan, from the phone call. How you doing over there?
He
I'm
must be
doing
in a.
fine.
You must be in a
Well,
secret
I think we're going
location.
overtime, aren't we?
Yeah, that's right. He's covert today, Chris.
Yeah, yeah. I just wow, but this has been amazing. Yeah, I couldn't believe. Well, I can't say. We're only early days here in this podcast. Like I say, they'll be released shortly after Christmas. I'll let you know. And our previous guest to you, believe it or not, was Martin Willis, who's been a veteran of podcasts for 10 years. And I told him, I said, I think we got 10 in the can right now. So I'll have to
Right.
have you back on my 10-year anniversary. I'm hoping that we can stay with it and sustain it. But, um, wow, we have the full range of guests already. And I'll tell you, it would have been
I
remiss
was
if we
on with
didn't have
Martin.
you. Yeah,
Right.
he's a great guy. He's kind of a voice of reason amongst podcasters because some of them they're out there and on the astral plane but Martin has a standard. He has an open mind, but he doesn't let it open up to the point where your brain falls out on the ground. Some of them do that, but no, he's podcasting's new to me, but I respect the body of work. Oh, there's our audio cue.
Yeah,
Mr.
and
Music
I
has
just want to
approached.
say as well, Jan, before we go, that because a guy like you is boots on the ground, you guys often slip between the cracks and get lost sometimes. And one of the big mandates of this show is trying to find out how do we push the narrative further within the UFO phenomena, and
Yeah.
keeping voices like you alive is really relevant to us and the
Well,
future of the field.
it's guys like him. This is where the work's being done that makes this real. That makes it relevant. That it's not a rumor. It's not as told by Professor X or all this kind of crap.
Yeah, if I could just about 10 seconds.
Go.
What we are doing right now is scanning the CUFOS files, which include the NICAP files and
Yeah.
a huge amount of data. And we're scanning that and making it digital, and it will be available all around the world. It won't go away in a fire or a flood or something.
Amazing.
Cool.
We've got up to 1970 so far.
Bravo.
I remember the 70s. Does that mean I wasn't really there? That's what some people say. Oh no, that's the 60s. That's the 60s, right? Well, again, Jan, what a pleasure to have you there. Stick around for a bit, and we'll just talk for a minute there as the music takes us out, puts us in the mood.
Thank you.